I'm someone who worked very extensively with an authenticity reader, and I want to make that clarification because we often say sensitivity reader, and we say it as if they recognize a problem, it was their sensitivities. It wasn't their sensitivities, it was your failures. My name's David Joy. I'm a novelist from North Carolina, and more specifically the North Carolina mountains in Appalachia. I make my living as a novelist. I don't teach at a university like a lot of American writers. I live very frugally off of what I'm able to make off of writing. But other than that, I spend the majority of my time in the woods. I spend my mornings sipping coffee on the porch, reading books and thinking about the story. I think, since I was a very small child, before, my mother would say that I was writing before I could spell, which is to say that I would pull out an old typewriter and I would tell her stories and she would tell me how to spell the words. And I did that at 4 years old. And there's a part of me that recognizes kind of the romanticism of a statement like that. But I think the important thing for me is that I can see that there was a compulsion to create and there was a compulsion to tell story that existed from a very early age. And the distinction of that word is very important to me. It is a compulsion. It's not something that I'm told to do. It's not something that I'm asked to do. It is something that I quite literally feel compelled to do, to the point that, it feels as if I would die if I didn't. I think that there are all different types of, stories. So the answers could vary widely. But as far as the types of stories that I write, and the types of stories that interest me, I always go back to something that the American short story writer George Saunders said, and he said that fiction, when it's done well, has the capacity to serve as empathy's training wheels. And I'm writing about people who have historically been disenfranchised, people who have not been able to have their story told, people who were historically silenced and not given a stage. And so for me, it is very much a practice of providing that stage and providing a voice for people who have historically not been given the humanity that they deserve. I think I'm very much rooted in writers like Ron Rash. Ron Rash was a mentor and friend of mine. He was also the person that, when I look back, the biggest influence on me that he had was that he handed me the right books at the right time, which is a very important thing. I can remember him handing me a copy of William Gay's I Hate to See That Evening Sun Go Down, and it was the first time that I had ever encountered my people on the page, and that was an incredibly empowering moment as a young writer. So I look back, and it's writers like Ron Rash, it's writers like William Gay, it's writers like Larry Brown, Harry Crews, Barry Hannah. But then it's also writers like Eudora Welty and Flannery O'Connor and Crystal Wilkinson and Ernest Gaines and Randall Keenan, and I could rattle it off forever, because at the heart of things, I am a reader. I'm someone who's just obsessed with language and the musicality of language, and when a story is told well. Absolutely. Yeah. You can't, one can't exist without the other. You can't, there's not a writer on this planet, who could arrive at all of the skills that it takes to truly craft a novel without having studied the novels of other writers. And I think that's an important distinction as well, is that it's one thing to be a reader, and it's one thing to read a book for enjoyment and pleasure. It's a whole nother thing to read that book as a study of craft. You know, I can remember the very first time that I ever read Daniel Woodrell's Tomato Red, and I read the first chapter and I realized that I hadn't taken a breath. And my immediate thought was, how in the fuck did he do it? And for the next month, I read that chapter over and over and over again, trying to figure out how did he make it as propulsive as he made it. And I think to be a writer, and to be a good writer, and a writer that has the ability to mature, and a writer who has the ability to have a body of work in which the scope continues to expand, then you have to constantly be sharpening the tools. Somewhat, you know, when I went to college, I wound up where I was going because I was chasing a girl, which is the best of reasons. But when I got there, I didn't have any idea what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to write. I'd been writing, you know, since I was a child. By the time I got to college, I'd probably written 1,000 pages. I probably, you know, none of it was any good. I probably wrote another 1,000 in college. None of it was any good. Yeah, I was a very slow study, but I knew I wanted to write. And at some point in time, it kind of goes back to your last question, which is that I'd heard, if you want to be a good writer, you have to read. And I was smart enough to recognize that I had not read the things that I needed to read yet. And so I decided to study literature. And so as an undergraduate, I studied literature. And I took creative writing classes, but that wasn't the focus. And I never went and got an MFA. I don't have an MFA. So yes, I studied writing, but not in the way that a lot of American writers have. I think it largely depends on the writer. You know, I think of a writer like Ace Atkins, who is an incredibly talented novelist, someone who is deeply tied to the American South, and at the same time, he's a sort of chameleon on the page. Like, he's able to inhabit places and spaces and people and language that is not his own. You know, he continued one of the most famous Robert Parker series, you know, for a very long time. And that series was set in Boston. Well, Ace isn't from Boston. But anybody who knows Boston reads that work and thinks he got it right. That is not something that I'm capable of doing as a writer. You know, for me, it goes back to that moment when I first encountered my people and my language and my place on the page. And it was this empowering moment as a writer, because up until then, everything had been, you know, pageantry. It had been me believing that I have to write these stories in order for it to matter. And suddenly I recognized that that wasn't true, and it was like jumping into the ocean. And at the heart of things, I always go back to something that Ron said, and Ron said, you have to get the details right in order for the reader to believe the big lie. And what he means by that is that fiction is an expansive lie that you're trying to convince this reader that this is real. And if you think about the way that a child gets caught in a lie, it's in those tiny details. It's when they slip and the parent's like, gotcha. So as a writer, it's important to get all of those very, very fine details, the minutia. All of that has to be spot on right, because the minute you make a mistake and the reader recognizes it, the lie is exposed. You know, it's very much the idea of the magic trick of the great and powerful Oz. You know, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. It's that kind of moment, you know, because you're trying to convince them this is real, and then you slip up, and suddenly the entire thing is exposed, the entire thing is compromised. It depends on the novel. And so I think about this last novel, Those We Thought We Knew, and it was a novel that required much more planning than my previous works. I tend to be a writer who doesn't like to really lay things out or plan. I tend to be a writer who works to get to know the characters intimately enough that once I place them on the page, I can follow them blindly. But with this last novel, it was the structure that I was playing with, playing with mystery, playing with the idea of a whodunit. As a form that requires much more planning. I think about the novelists who are good at that, novelists like Megan Abbott, Laura Littman, and the decisions they're making are surgically precise, and they have to be, because there are all of these lines running at the same time that are eventually going to intersect. It requires more planning. Those writers who are good at that are surgical, and my natural style is very much more blunt force trauma. I'm kind of the fumbling caveman on the page sometimes, and so every novel's different. It just depends what you're wanting that particular book to do. Absolutely. For me, the revision is when things get incredibly fun. My mother was a potter, and I've always likened that first draft to digging clay, like it's work. You've got a shovel in your hands, and you're digging clay, and you're trying to refine that clay and get it manageable to something you can work with. Revision is the moment you get to put it on the wheel, and you get to get your hands dirty, and you get to give it shape. That's where things are really made. And when it's going well, there's not a word on the page that I haven't considered. I'm very interested in sound and the way that words sound next to each other, the musicality of language. I'm also interested in trying to force a reader. I believe wholeheartedly that I can force a reader to continue to read even when they want to go to sleep. I'm somebody who believes wholeheartedly that I can force rhythm through choices with meter. I think there are all of these things that you can do to control things at a level that the average person doesn't think about. And all of those things are crafted at the moment of revision. Those aren't things that tend to happen at draft stage. I would say that the similarity I see between writing and between hunting and fishing has less to do with that, and it has more to do with living entirely inside the moment, right? Like in my day-to-day life, you're constantly worried about the future, you're constantly dwelling on the past, but when I'm in the woods, or when I'm on the water, or when I'm on the page, nothing else exists outside of that. And so I think, as a human, that's the place I feel most comfortable, most safe. There's something deeply spiritual about those three acts to me. So I'm someone who worked very extensively with an authenticity reader, and I want to make that clarification, because we often say sensitivity reader, and we say it as if they recognize a problem, it was their sensitivities. It wasn't their sensitivities, it was your failures. You get authenticity readers when you're trying to cross gaps. And so if you're crossing the gap of gender, if you're crossing the gap of sexuality, if you're crossing the gap of race, class, place, all of these things, the question becomes, does the crossing of that gap involve power? And in my case, as a white American man, there is no gap that I can cross that does not involve power. And if I make a mistake, that mistake is not the result of someone else's sensitivities. It's the result of me being incapable of delivering that perspective authentically. And so the opportunity, and that's an important distinction, it is an opportunity to work with an authenticity reader. And I think about this last novel of mine, and I'll never forget, my editor called and she said, David, she said, usually when we get an authenticity reader, we might get 2.5 pages of feedback. I had 30 pages of feedback and another 10 of citations, grounding the work in scholarship. The woman was brilliant. It was a brilliant black female academic who I will never know, who questioned all of these things and brought all of these things to my attention. And at the end of the day, you know, does that mean that I changed everything that she said? Of course not. But it means that I most assuredly thought about it, and I considered it, and I thought, is this the right decision? Do I need to do this? And that's the thing. And so when people say they don't want to have a reader like that, the truth is that it's typically something that comes from white men who do not want to do the work and who do not want to be held accountable when they fail. And the work that they're doing, those types of failures are not inconsequential. When you're dealing with historical power, those types of failures carry very real consequences. You know, they carry the consequence of perpetuating stereotypes. They carry all of these things. And so for me personally, it's something that I very deeply value, and that I appreciate the hell of out of having that opportunity. It made the work better. Read, you know, read. And read broadly, you know, because I look back and as a kid, I did not like reading. You know, I was into my 20s before I really started finding books that I loved. And when I look back, it was just because I was never handed the right book. You know, and so I think that's important, is to search out the literature that fills you up inside, because I can assure you it exists. You know, and then there are always the surprises as well, you know, the books that we find that affect us that we never would have expected. You know, I can remember piles of books like that for me. But I think that's the main advice. And then I think the other thing is just keep doing it. It's not something that you're going to get good at overnight. It takes a very long time, you know, and in the moment you might think this is brilliant. And then 10 years down the road, you look back and you think this is shit. That's kind of the natural progression of a writer. The reason that I do not fear AI is that it can't duplicate originality, right? Like the way that AI functions is that it takes a data set, it recognizes similarities within that data set and uses those things to recreate. That's not how the creative's mind works. You know, I think about the novel that I'm working on, and the entire thing was delivered to me in a dream like a gift. Like I don't even feel like I made it up. I woke up from a dream. My girlfriend at the time was sitting in bed beside of me, and I just started screaming, "Give me paper, give me paper." And this woman was talking to me in my dream. She told me the first line of the novel. She told me the entire scope of the novel. She told me the last line of the novel. She told me what the book should do. and I woke up and I had it in my hands. I can't even explain how something like that happens. But what I'm getting at is that from the beginning of time, you have had storytellers and you have had people who were the keepers of history and who were the keepers of story, whether they were drawing that story on a wall in petroglyphs, or whether they were telling a story with language the way that we're doing now. It is something that is essential to what it means to be human, and I do not fear ever losing that. There's nothing that can take that away.